right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donnie Vadinsky, and I am your host for today's valuable program. On Standing for Truth, we uphold the truth of biblical creation. It is a privilege, as always, to have Dr. Grady S. McMurtry, an experienced creation scientist, here with me to assist in accomplishing this important mission. In this program, Dr. Grady is going to show why young Earth creation is true and evolution is false. We are going to do this by answering your questions and challenges. And anybody who's familiar with Dr. Grady S. McMurtry knows that he's well-rounded and truly an encyclopedia worth of information on all things origins. Now, Dr. Grady has been a tremendous blessing to this ministry. If you'd like to see more from him, please check the description box of this video for links to his website and also his YouTube channel and our past programs together. There are many, Dr. Grady. It's not our first rodeo here together. And so it's great to have you back. I think last time you were here was 2 or 3 months ago. And so, Dr. Grady, tell us all, how have you been, brother?
Well, I have been fine. Although, Donnie, I'm a little concerned when you said well-rounded. You know, there's the mental and then there's the physical aspect of that statement.
I meant the mental aspect, of
Oh,
course.
good. Thank you. Appreciate that. Oh, yeah, I've just returned from about a 6-week trip up to Michigan and Indiana speaking. Before that, I had just made a mission trip to Kazakhstan, and we had used creation evangelism, and in fact had a salvation in Kazakhstan a couple of months back.
Awesome. Okay, well, praise the Lord. That's what it's all about, brother. We could win arguments all day, but it's about winning souls, evangelizing, bringing people the gospel. So, Dr. Grady, you're doing an excellent job. And again, I do want to encourage people. We are doing this live, so more and more people are making their way into our live chat. Please, I encourage you, check the description box of this video. Check the website, standfortruthministries.com as well. I've got a section with Dr. Grady S. McMurtry and all our past programs together. And so I see questions flying in already, but before we get to your questions in the audience specifically, let's set the foundation for tonight. And what I'd like to do, Dr. Grady, is start the show with a bang. I'm not talking about the big bang, but with a bang with this question, okay? So, Dr. Grady, a popular theologian has recently claimed that the real elephant in the room, apparently, is the flood story. He has scoffed, like many anti-young Earth creationists, he has scoffed at the Bible's account of the entire world being covered by water in a global catastrophic flood event. He says this is indefensible scientifically and historically. And so what I want to do is prove this theologian, William Lane Craig, wrong on his assertions. And so this is why I want to set the foundation by focusing first on the flood. And therefore, Dr. Grady, my first question is going to deal with the scriptures. And I want to establish, what does the Bible teach about the flood? Dr. Grady, was the flood local or global according to God's word?
Well, there's no question about it that in the Bible, wherever we look, whether it is in Genesis, particularly chapter 7, 8, 9, whether it's in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, whether it's in 2 Peter chapter 3, the Bible clearly declares that the flood of Noah was catastrophic, cataclysmic over the entire earth. In Genesis and in Psalm 104, which is the chronology of the flood in verses 5 through 9, it talks about the water was standing above the mountains. And this is not a local flood. I mean, after all, if the water was standing above the mountains, it would at least slop over into the next valley. So, I mean, but in addition to that, of course, the physical evidence is beyond a shadow of a doubt around the world of a huge, catastrophic, cataclysmic worldwide flood. Not only from histories of stories of over 200 flood stories around the world and cultures, but simply think about it for a second. The earth is covered, roughly 75 to 80% of the dry land is covered by sedimentary rock layers, meaning dried out mud. That ought to tell you a clue right there. Of course, evolutionists will say that it was slow and gradual, but the evidence is that, in fact, it was quite rapid. Indeed, the Bible says it took 300 days for the waters to go up and back down again. Last verse of chapter 7 in Genesis into chapter 8, the waters went up 150 days, went down 150 days. People misunderstand the word mountain too. They'll say, well, the water could not possibly have covered mountains that we have today, such as Mount Everest. Obviously, very true. But Mount Everest didn't exist prior to the flood. And in geological science, a mountain is anywhere from 1,000 up to, by increments of thousands, say up to a mile, which is all that was necessary. The amount of water coming out from below was about a mile deep. And so it could cover any mountains that were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 feet high. And that is what's being described in Genesis chapters 7, 8, and also in Psalm 104. And so whether we take a look at the scripture or we take a look at the physical evidence, it is absolutely positive that the earth was, at least at one time, if you want to argue about when, but at one time it was covered by floodwaters, that the land, the hills, the low mountains that existed before the flood were completely eroded by tidal tsunamis during the time of the flood. They were ground up into basically muddy water, deposited as wet mud layers or the sedimentary rocks that we see today, which lithified fairly quickly, containing fossils. And there's so many inconsistencies with what is called historic geology. That's the evolutionary atheist geology versus the flood geology of the Bible. Polystrate fossils up and upside down, mass graves. We find layers that are not in order. As a matter of fact, most of them are not in order, according to what we find in the geological textbooks that are being written by evolutionists. I would also comment, William Lane Craig is a disciple of Norman Geisler, or was, and he takes a very, very aberrant position to Christian theology today. Now, years ago, he was a bit better, but today he doesn't even believe in a literal Adam and Eve. And if you don't believe in a literal Adam and Eve, then you cannot possibly believe in a salvation through Jesus Christ. So while he was at one time perhaps a legitimate Christian apologist, today he doesn't qualify.
Dr. Grady, those are some great points. We'll definitely be digging deeper into the scientific evidence very soon. There's a lot there. Again, a lot of great points. So what I'd like to ask you next is, as you're familiar with, brother, proponents of the local flood theory, they'll say, okay, we've got this universal language. All of the earth was covered by water, so on and so forth. But they'll say that all could apply to a local region, kind of like where the Bible says that Caesar went out to tax the whole world. And they'll say, well, that wasn't literally the whole globe. That was the known world at the time. And so perhaps these words, all and whole, was just describing Noah's little regional world that he was familiar with. He would look out and everything that he saw, that's what was flooded. And so what would be a good way to engage that objection, Dr. Grady?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that we take a look in Genesis. God is the only one in the universe who can use the word all and mean it. You and I use it generically. I could say to those listening, all of the people listening are Christians. I don't know that. I would have no way of knowing that.
Right.
But if God were counting, so to speak, those that were actually online with us, and all but one was saved, he wouldn't say all. He would say all but one, or some, or most. I mean, whatever would be an appropriate term. And when you take a look at Genesis chapter 7, God says he is going to kill all of the living organisms on the surface of the earth, except those in the ark and those that didn't have to be in the ark, because there were many animals that did not have to be in the ark. You know, there were no aquariums on the ark. Aquatic life didn't have to be in the ark. But because the qualifier was only that the creature had to live on dry land and had to breathe air through nostrils. But in terms of the life that was on the dry land, which is what God clearly describes, he says all of the dry land creatures and the people are going to die, except those in the ark. And at the close of the flood, he stipulates that he did do that. And so there's no equivocation here. It's not a local flood, it is a global flood. And of course, we see these sedimentary layers, in some cases, contiguous for more than 1,000 miles. That's hardly a local flood. We can connect layers across vast stretches of the continents, basically around the world in some cases. And again, the anomalies that are there are very important. But God does say all. And Peter, he uses the Greek word for cataclysm, that the earth was cataclysmically destroyed, and that completely changed. The entire surface was changed by the flood. And so again, this is not local, this is global.
That's right, Dr. Grady. Those are some great points again. And doesn't God emphasize the universal nature as well? Because just reading Genesis 7:19, for example, in front of me, it says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. So we got all and whole. What is the importance of that emphasis where he's using both words there?
Well, again, it's a redundancy. Now, in Hebrew, we're talking about what's called Hebrew parallelism. That in Hebrew, you say something once, and then you say the same thing a second time for emphasis, but you say it in slightly different terms. Now, again, I would point out that words do have different nuances, and you have to look at them within the context of what they're being used. But for example, God loved, us so much, he sent his only son to die for us, correct? But in John 3, God so loved the world. Now, does that mean terra firma? Does that mean he so loved the earth that he sent his son to die on a cross? Hardly. In the time of Peleg, it says that the earth was divided, but there the word is not referring to the physical earth, it is referring to the human population. In the same way that the word world in John 3:16 is referring to the human population. And so earth and world can have different meanings. And again, I would stipulate that while in Genesis we have a description of the flood and its massive, massive effects, the chronology of the flood is in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9. The exact specific chronological order is given to us there. And in verse 5, God sends a worldwide flood. He says in verse 6, the mountains that existed, again, these were 1 mile high or less, but the mountains that did exist before the flood were completely covered by water. Verse 7, the waters go away. Then in verse 8, it talks about the mountains that exist today rising up. And finally, in verse 9, he says that he will never again flood the entire earth. But there have been thousands of floods since that time. And so they were local, but this one was global.
That's a good point you bring up on Psalm 104. And I've heard many in the local flood old earth camp and the theistic evolution camp, they'll say, well, Psalm 104 is not describing the flood, it's restating the creation event. Dr. Grady, have you heard that? And what's a good response?
Well, no, I haven't heard it, so to speak, but that's more the people that believe in the gap theory, because in the gap theory, Chalmers invented in 1813, he took the waters of creation in Genesis 1:2 and perverted it into what he referred to as Lucifer's flood, and that was the flood of the entire earth, and therefore relegating Noah's flood to being local. I mean, that's the kind of thing those people are talking about.
Right.
But in fact, the waters of creation have nothing to do. As a matter of fact, think about it. The dry land didn't exist until day 3, and the water covered the surface on day 1 and day 2. But God was accomplishing other things. And so it cannot possibly be, based on the scriptural terms, and again, I revert to science, that Noah's flood was simply local. Again, why would you build an ark in the first place? Why would you take 100 years to build the ark? Why would God give him the architectural drawings? What purpose would that serve? And if it were a local flood, First of all, there wouldn't be enough water in a local flood to lift the ark off the ground. You wouldn't save all those animals. After all, if a local flood, you would perhaps kill not only thousands, maybe tens of thousands of animals.
Right.
After all, when you take a look at what the fire did out in Yellowstone National Park years ago, tens of thousands of animals died. But what happens? Well, they replace each other rather quickly. I think you'll have to agree. Squirrels will make more squirrels.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, Noah's given 100 years to preach. And so, I mean, that's plenty of time for Noah to move. Well, why did the birds have to go onto the ark?
Donnie, it's 120. God gave him 120. And so I can't tell you this with absolute certainty, but I would suggest to you that for the first 20 years, God is giving him the architectural drawings. And then for 100 years, they have the construction period. Because God says that I'm not going to strive for man, but I'm going to give him 120 years was a warning to get your act together. Because if you don't get it together within 120 years, I'm going to send this thing that's going to destroy the entire surface of the earth.
That right there is an interesting point, because some have interpreted, and I like your interpretation better, unless there's a dual meaning there, but some have interpreted the 120 years to apparently mean God saying man is not going to live after the flood past 120 years. But you're saying, no, that's God saying man has on this earth before the flood comes 120 years.
It has nothing to do with longevity. It is simply a 120-year warning. After all, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Shem, 500 years after the flood. And people continue to live much longer than 120, all the way down to the time of David. And even today, if you look carefully, the world's oldest human being dying, this year is 117 or 113 or whatever. And so in that standpoint, if you want to talk about longevity, while longevity of human life definitely fell after the flood. And it's the first mathematical curve described in human literature. And it is a mathematical curve. Living 912 average for men. We don't know about women, maybe 1,000. But the decline in human longevity fits a mathematical curve that's very easy to calculate. However, you never make a decision based on an average. And you don't determine truth by voting. And I want to make both those statements very plain. The fact of the matter is that the actual maximum lifetime of a human being has not really changed in 4,000 years. And it's roughly 120. But that's coincidental to the 120 where God says before the flood, I'm not going to continue to strive with this debauchery and sinful stuff that was going on before the flood, and there was plenty of it. He says, nevertheless, I'm going to give you 120 years to repent. And, Donnie, I think we've said this before in the program. Imagine the frustration in ministry. Now, I've been in the ministry 50 years. But imagine the frustration in ministry when, amongst getting the plans and the drawings and the building, Noah did preach righteousness for 120 years and only got 7 other people saved.
Wow. Yeah. And in a way, we're seeing a lot of similarities today to that, where we are preaching repentance, giving the gospel, warning people of God's judgment by fire in the future if they don't get saved. And what do? A lot of them scoff. They don't take it seriously.
And I, again, these people who wanted to relegate the flood of Noah to mean a local flood, etc., and they deny the truth of Scripture, and I would say the inerrancy of Scripture. Again, at the end of the flood, God promises that he will never again flood the earth as he did.
Right.
And so that, again, relegates it cannot possibly be a local flood. It has to be a global flood. Because, again, we've had tens of thousands of floods on the earth since that time, but only that one covered the entire earth.
Would you say then to local flood proponents when they try and say, well, all or whole can just be regional, not literally the whole earth? So we're dealing with context then, the context of the flood narrative, God speaking. So obviously when he says all and whole, he literally means that. The context itself dictates the size or the true meaning of all, Dr. Grady? Or I'm wondering what would be a good way to think through that.
Well, again, the context is very important. There's no question about that. But take a look at all the verses that have to do with the flood being, shall we say, global versus local. Clearly in Genesis 7:19 to 23, he says, I'm going to, and he uses all. In Genesis 9:12 to 17, he says, I did do all. And we've mentioned Psalm 104. But how about Luke 17:26 and 27? The flood destroyed them all. 2 Peter, we've talked about the world was cataclysmically destroyed. Again, I would say, why build an ark for a local flood? Just walk away. You got 120 years to walk away. You can walk a long way in 120 years. Again, the animals would replenish. But think about the words that are being used in context. There's the words all, every. It doesn't say few, some. But this again before and also after the flood. You would take away the promise, the unilateral covenant of God with the earth, with his bow in the air, which is not the rainbow. It's a sign of peace or war. Now, again, how much do you have to hear before you suddenly realize that the local argument just doesn't hold any water, so to speak?
Right. I like that. No pun intended, of course.
None whatsoever.
Dr. Grady, what are your thoughts on Job 41:11? It says, who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. Wouldn't the local flood thinking be, well, okay, everything under the regional area is God? No, clearly he's saying, correct me if I'm wrong, everything in the universe is
to me, heaven would more than cover the earth,
Right. Yeah. Not just, a local region
right.
Type saying. And so, okay, I'll say this first. It's interesting in the video that a lot of young earth creationists are responding to with William Lane Craig. He actually says, believe it or not, he rejects the local flood theory. He says, when I read through the flood narrative in Genesis, it's clearly describing a worldwide flood. He doesn't even deny that.
Right.
But he ends up trying to symbolize it, or, he thinks scientifically, historically, linguistically, it doesn't work, but he doesn't deny what the scripture is clearly saying, Dr. Grady.
Well, no, again, see, he's trying to do a forced interpretation to fit his own ideology. The better way to read the Bible is to read it as it is. And you read it as, again, not necessarily literally, because that's a big mistake. But you do read it as completely and 100% inerrant. And after all, if you take it literally, which translation, unless you read Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek to start with, you're dealing with interpretations or translations. And that's going to throw you off, period. So I have never been concerned about a word for word translation. I have always been concerned with an interpretation by concept. And I think that's a much better way to study the scriptures.
So when you say read it as it is, for the audience sake, is that us recognizing the existence of imagery, symbolism, real historical events?
Well, see, God cannot put within us something he does not have or cannot do. And therefore, if we use simile, analogy, parable, and on, we can only do it because he does it. And again, in the Bible, for instance, when Jesus institutes the communion during what we call the Last Supper, a mock Seder, he says, take this bread, this is my body. Well, that's an implied metaphor. So we see that God uses every single linguistic tool that we do, and we can only do it because he did it first. And so we need to rightly divide the word, correctly interpret it, etc., rightly divide it, by recognizing the use of all the same kind of literary tools that we have. And again, reading it as inerrant, but that words have meaning based on context. And for instance, there are words in the English language that have the same sound but different meanings. The same thing is true in Hebrew. And so if I were to say to you the word peace, and did I just say P-E-A-C-E or P-I-E-C-E? Unless I use it in context, or unless you can see it on a written piece of paper, you don't know which one it is simply because I said it. That one word is not sufficient, and it could have a multitude of meanings, but it is based on context. And so there are nuances. Every word pretty much that we use in our language can be used with more than one nuance.
I appreciate that response, Dr. Grady. So what if a critic, just playing devil's advocate, what if an old earth creationist local flood proponent, as we are familiar with, because I've read articles and seen arguments in debates from people, for example, from Reasons to Believe, they'll say, well, Noah was just following God's commandment. So the reason why he didn't move in 120 years was because he was taking God's commandment seriously to preach repentance, to warn people of the flood. And so that massive ark was used as a platform to preach and get people's attention. Clearly didn't really get their attention, obviously, since only he and his family went on the ark. But that's kind of their response to some of our points, Dr. Grady. How would you engage that?
Well, first of all, I know what you're talking about, and I know who wrote it. And I think it's absolute foolishness.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you don't need a structure the size of the ark to be a pulpit. And again, why would you build a pulpit and put roughly 17,000 animals inside it, as it eventually did have? I don't know about you, but I don't want to muck out a barn with that many animals in it. No, I mean, it's a foolish concept to try to force those kind of interpretations. It is somebody who has an agenda, will twist any scripture to mean anything they want in order to deceive people into accepting their particular concepts, ideology. But obviously, it's totally counter. I mean, the one that you're particularly mentioning there is so ridiculous. One wonders how he even came up with it. But you would not need a 450-foot long vessel. I would also point out that, just talking about nuances, the word used for the Ark of Noah, or in some translations used for the Ark of Bulrushes of the baby Moses floating down the Nile, has several major meanings in Hebrew. And of course, one is an object made for floating. Okay, the Ark or the bulrushes were definitely floating. It means a rectangular, solid shaped object. And it is the Hebrew word for coffin, C-O-F-F-I-N. Now, if you read the scripture, and that's what it says, you will see that there's a symbolic nature there. Now, I wrote a book on the feasts of the Old Testament because of my own personal experiences over my lifetime with the Jewish community. I'm not a Jew, I never was, but I grew up in the Jewish community. And first of all, the word coffin is 6 straight boards. In death, we were all equal, so it doesn't matter how much money you had when you died. Secondly, if you don't understand that, then you don't understand the symbology. Because at the time of the flood, God, using opposite logic to the way human beings normally would use logic, what did he do? Well, we normally think of a coffin with death inside and life outside. But in the case here of the flood, God took the seeds of life, placed them inside the coffin, and condemned the world outside to death. And when the ark came to rest, Genesis 8:4, on the 17th day of Nisan in the spring of the year, the seeds of life were resurrected into a new world. And as I point out,
Oh, Dr. Grady, I think we might have lost your audio when your phone came in. Dr. Grady, can you hear?
I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. You're good now.
Yeah. I was pointing out if you don't accept the ark as the actual container for the 8 people and the 17,000 or so animals, although it could have been less, it might have been as few as 1,800. then you're losing the symbology of this word coffin. Because God, using opposite logic at the time of the flood, puts the seeds of life inside the coffin, condemns the world outside to death. When it lands on the 17th day of Nisan, Genesis 8:4, and then it says, then the waters went down for 150 days. I don't think that's a local flood either. But you lose the symbology of the 17th day of Nisan. God has a theme for each and every feast day, and he does exactly the same thing on exactly the same day of the calendar over thousands of years. And so this theme of baptism and resurrection, or baptism and internment. I'm using the word internment there because when you baptize somebody in water, then that's internment in water, and the symbology of resurrection from it, identification with Christ. Well, think with me. Again, on the 17th day of Nisan, the ark came to rest, and the seeds of life were resurrected into a new world after being baptized in the flood. But it's exactly the same day in the book of Exodus where they passed through the Red Sea. In Corinthians, it tells us that the nation of Israel was being baptized by walking through the Red Sea and then resurrected out of the waters of baptism to go on to the promised land. Same exact date on the calendar. And then I document how the same thing is true in Joshua. They go through the river on the 10th, and they celebrate first fruits, which is the feast of first fruits, the third major feast of the Old Testament, on the 17th day of Nisan in the promised land. So they were baptized in the Jordan, and they celebrate first fruits on the 17th. And then if we go to the book of John, it is exactly the same day that Christ rose from the dead. And so, again, the symbology would be totally blown away if this is nothing but a pulpit to preach from.
Dr. Grady, this is what I mean by encyclopedia worth of information. Those are some great points. And I agree with you. These are some pretty wild ideas. And I wonder where they get these interpretations. And
it's an attempt to say that the scriptures are not to be taken as inerrant, that these are metaphorical, that they're allegorical. And the person that you were talking about specifically believes that God used a big bang explosion to create the universe back 10, 12, 13 billion supposed years ago. He's an astrophysicist who was educated by evolutionists. And he believes that evolutionary time is true. But evolutionary time, or what is also called in science deep time, is unsupportable. Certainly the Bible doesn't support it, and science doesn't either. We have roughly 450 geochronometers today to prove that everything we see is young, that these billions and billions of supposed years never really happened, and that this man and his organization are leading people down a primrose path to not heaven.
Yeah, it's a serious matter. It's an authority issue for sure. And pretty soon I'll ask you what this individual, William Lane Craig, why he believes in evolution, what he thinks is the best evidence for it, and we'll have you dismantle it. But sticking to the flood narrative for now, one big question I have, because this was an argument used in a recent debate as well, they'll say, well, okay, the flood was universal, but, and if I remember correctly, I think it's in 2 Peter 2 or 2 Peter 5, where it talks about the flood came upon, Dr. Grady, the world of the ungodly. So they'll say, well, at that time, the world wasn't covered with people. It's not like people spread out into the entire planet. And so wherever ungodly people were, that's what was flooded. And so they didn't need to flood the Americas or Antarctica. So I'm curious, Dr. Grady, what would be a good way to address that challenge?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it would be a true statement that the flowers came on the ungodly because the only godly ones were in the ark. Secondly, though, remember that what is referred to usually as Pangea did not separate until the time of the flood. That was the mechanism that caused Pangea, created on day 3, the creation week, broke apart. And therefore, roughly 40% of the Earth's surface was dry land. It was all connected except for a few islands. There were, and we've got the evidence for a few islands, but basically it was all connected. Well, if it's going to be a flood that would cover one continent, well, all the continents were connected, so that means it covered all the continents. It's just they
Right.
weren't continents at the time.
Yeah. And so with what you're saying here, this flood model where basically you have one supercontinent, you could say, in the pre-flood world, and at the flood it breaks apart and moves largely into their current positions today.
Right.
In Genesis, can we defend that by pointing to the verse that describes all the waters in one place? Therefore,
well, exactly. You see, on day 3, there was water on the surface. That's from verse 2, day 1. So God creates time, space, mass, the earth, and it was at the time of its creation in darkness, because God doesn't create light till verse 3. And that there was a layer of water on the surface of the earth. It could have been up to a mile deep. We don't know. Wasn't there to measure it, but it could have been. And that's the water of creation. That then later, on day 3, God causes the dry land to rise up out of that water, and he creates what we call basically Pangea. Although, as I say, again, there were some islands, but not a lot of them, but there were some islands. From what we can count, probably in the areas of less than 200, though some of the evidence might have been eliminated. And that he gathers the waters into one place. Well, that means the land was in the other one place. And so we have this Pangea. It did not break apart until the time of the flood, when the water, and now the video that we have on the flood, where I show the maps that have no water, and I show how the continents really do fit together quite well.
Yeah.
And, it's called the waters cleave. And the reason for that is that's the Hebrew terminology used in Genesis 7, that the water is knifed through from below, breaking what we call Pangea into the continents we have today, and that they can move very rapidly and only in 1 year because of the water below that God created on day 2. So on day 2, God creates a layer of water down below. It's roughly a mile thick. It's 10 to 11 miles down. We've found remnants of it. There's still remnants there. There's still water coming out from that original water called juvenile water, coming up through various events like volcanoes and black smokers, mineral springs. But the evidence is clearly described in the Bible, and that evidence is clearly seen on a globe, as I show, that has no water. And I think one of the questions people ought to ask themselves is, why don't evolutionists want me to see what's on the bottom of the ocean? They show you maps, they show you globes, they show you the continents, they show you the surface of oceans or Great Lakes, but they don't show you the bottom of the ocean. Why? Because it would show you the evidence of Noah's flood, and they don't want you to see it.
Wow, that's an interesting point. And so for a creationist who might be skeptical or hesitant to hold a position that says the pre-flood world may have been one big supercontinent with small islands, because they think that's too close to plate tectonics and Pangea and deep time evolution, a good verse to point them to would be the verse that you just discussed, where all the waters are in one place. Therefore, logically, the land would be in one place. Yeah.
And that there was a layer of water down below that God created, knowing he would need it 1,656 years later. And that mile thick layer of water down below, like I said, it's roughly 10 to 11 miles down, allows the continents, once Pangea is split by the waters knifing through from below, then the continents are floating on a layer of water. And think about it, up in Canada, you're certainly very familiar where you are, with lakes and boats and so on. So if you think about it, how easy is it to push a boat away from a dock if the boat is floating on water? Well, a child could do it, correct? It takes very little effort whatsoever. And so while the water is coming out and the continents are slowly going down, and the water goes from underneath to on top, sort of reversing their position. That water also allows the continents to slide very, very quickly, which is where we get the thousands of miles today.
So when the Bible describes in Genesis 7, and I think the deep, if I'm not mistaken, is used a couple times, maybe elsewhere in Proverbs. The fountains of the great deep breaking forth, is that the water coming?
It's coming up from this layer of water down below that was created on day 2. And so if you take a look, for instance, at the maps that I show in my video, you can clearly see that in the Indian Ocean, along the south slope of Indonesia, from India to Australia, you can see from the Gulf of Alaska to Kamchatka, you can see from Kamchatka all the way down to Vietnam, that today there are 2 continental shelves there, and one is a mile deep, and then it breaks off and goes another mile deep. This is why I say we could have had a layer of water, well, of course, initially, and again, I wasn't there, but maybe it was a quarter mile, half a mile deep during the creation week. But on day 3, when the land rises up out, well, that means that the waters are going to get higher, up to a mile. And then when the mile of water comes up from below, then that breaks off, leaving 2 miles deep. So the difference between a sea and an ocean is not the size, length, width. It is, in fact, the depth. And so seas are, roughly a mile or less deep, but oceans are 2 miles or more deep. For instance, in the Pacific around the Hawaiian Islands, it's 2.6 miles down. So that's the basic difference, shallow and deep. And that's another testimony to the amount of water that came up from below at the time of the flood.
Well, that's incredible, because we see a lot of critics. They'll say, well, the rapid movement of those plates, continental sprint, these plates essentially moving along at meters per second movements rather than the snail pace movements we see today. They'll say that would have caused way too much friction, that it would have led to too much heat and energy, and it basically would have melted the crust. But if you have all this water, Dr. Grady, maybe you could speak to this, all that water would be lubricating the plates as they're sliding along.
Correct.
Reducing friction
and basically floating like boats, like I said. And those who believe in plate subduction and friction there, it would be a problem, which is why I don't accept that model. But if you accept a model where the crust of the earth, and I'll liken it to, say, an eggshell with liquid underneath. When the eggshell cracks, and you've seen them crack in a pot of boiling water, but once they're free to move, they're floating on a layer of water, and therefore they can float away very, very quickly. And you're not generating the heat that plate subduction would have a problem with.
And I guess if you have, because if I understood you correctly, you basically have the water underneath the crust. At the flood, the water comes to the top, so there's a switch, which means you'd have a lot of water to act as a buffer in a way for some of the heat and energy produced during the flood. It could act as like a natural nuclear reactor, perhaps.
Well, let's not say nuclear reactor, because it's a chain reaction of the decay of material. But think with me for a moment. As you go into the earth, it gets hotter on average of about 90 degrees Fahrenheit per mile. I was trying to think. I think that's 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer, if I remember the calculation correct, for those that are watching in places that use metrics. So when you think about it, if you go down 10 miles, you've got a temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's super critical water, or super hot water. And when it comes to the surface, it's going to explode, the equivalent of a massive, massive volcanic eruption. But you're going to get rapid cooling because of expansion once it hits the surface. It's also going to throw things into space, maybe comets, for instance, or what we think of as comets today. Why we have craters on the moon could be from that too. But the heat that comes up is, some of it's going to mix with the water already on the surface. Some of it's going to cool by very rapid expansion. You've probably opened up a soft drink when it was, shall we say, the wrong time, And as soon as you release the pressure, you could feel the container getting colder. And that's again because of the rapid expansion of the gases.
So this rapid expansion is leading to a balancing out effect or an equilibrium in a
Well,
way.
it allows you not to have a problem with the heat
Yeah.
coming up from below. And so it's mixing with warm tropical seas because actually it comes out above water surface only for a few hundred miles. And then the rest of it comes out underneath water that's already there. So that's going to be a buffer from the explosive force. There's going to be a mixing that's going to have some cooling, and you're going to have the expansion cooling to go along with it. And so that takes care of a lot of the physical problems that you're going to have with things like rapid plate subduction.
Absolutely. Okay, that's a great answer there. And so, in light of a few things that you've stated over our first little bit here together, you've kind of answered this question, but I think it's a good time now that we've really fully established the fact that the Bible clearly teaches a worldwide flood. It wasn't local or regional. This individual, William Lane Craig, in his video, he said just scientifically, it's indefensible that all life was killed on the earth and the whole earth was covered. There's no scientific evidence for it. You've provided a few really good lines of evidence, Dr. Grady, but that question, if posed to a creationist, that there's just absolutely no evidence, it's indefensible, how can we best respond, Dr.
Well, of course, William Lane Craig doesn't know his head from a hole in the ground when it comes to science. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, he's a theologian. I'm both. I have doctorates in both science and theology. But the fact of the matter is that when we take a look again at massive fossil graveyards, such as at Hell's Creek out west, when we take a look at the disarticulation of creatures, which would be because their dead bodies are being disarticulated in torrential currents, the burying of wet mud layers. We talk about polystrate fossils, and of course, most of us would think in terms of tree trunks, baby bones. But the fact of the matter is that almost any fossil is a polystrate fossil if it's something more than a single-celled organism. You take a look at the layers such as at the Grand Canyon or equivalent places such as down in Namibia, for instance, and you see all these layers, and evolution will tell you this is slow and gradual accumulation. But when you think about it and look at it, you'll see that they undulate, that they are folded. This could only happen if all those layers came into existence at the same time and were folded by tectonic forces while they were still wet. If they were all perfectly flat, there wouldn't be any of these undulations, these deformations, because if there were any movement, then the rocks would be broken. But they're not, for long stretches. And again, if you take a look at the idea that when you see layers, often there's hundreds and hundreds of layers of the same material that make up a whole section. Now, when you see those layers, it's not just one layer. It could be 10 layers, 100 layers, and they're almost always of the same thickness within each band. Now, if you were to think that was slow and gradual accumulation, you would have to believe, in some cases, that you would have 10 or 100 floods of exactly the same depth over exactly the same surface, supposedly over hundreds of thousands of years. Well, that would stretch credulity just by chance. But the folding and that the layers are not in the order shown in the textbook, generally speaking. Now, I know of 26 locations on the Earth where there are some of the layers in the order they're shown in the textbooks in the geological time scale, which is the Bible of the evolutionist. However, there's not that many layers in those locations, but sometimes, and of course, even by random chance, you'd expect to find some in the same order as sections of it. But what you find is the layers are upside down; they're missing. There's the folding. There's the again polystrate fossils of all kinds. there are so many things about these layers that do not possibly fit with the evolutionary story. It just debunks it completely. I have a photo taken out in the British Columbian Rockies. It's an official Canadian government photograph. In the top of the Canadian Rockies in British Columbia there, you see massive, massive, tight folding. And in some cases, you even say whole layers that are parallel to each other, just as you would kind of expect them, except they're not horizontal, they're vertical. Now, how could they be pushed into a vertical position, maintaining the integrity of the parallel layers? Unless it's mud, it's being folded, and that the whole section was block faulted and tilted up. And so in this one Canadian government photograph, it's your government,
That's right.
you know, on the one side, you'll see, I don't know, probably 15, 20 layers that are just perfectly flat and parallel with each other as you would expect in the ground, but they're not horizontal, they're vertical.
Wow.
And immediately next to that, you have this very, very tight folding. That can only be done by a worldwide flood with tectonic forces causing these layers to be pushed around, in some cases by whole blocks, in other cases, in the layers were laid down flat but then folded like an accordion. Again, I would point out the anomalies that we find in these layers. We find human artifacts, human footprints. We find human tools in layers that, according to evolutionists, would predate humans in their thinking of how humans evolved from some primate, but predate them by hundreds of millions of years and predate dinosaurs by up to 300 million years, according to the evolutionary religion, because it's religion, it's not science.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so much there, Dr. Grady. A significant point you made at first. You're both a theologian and a scientist.
Scientist first, and an evolutionist first.
Yeah, right. You've been there.
I've been on both sides. That's why I'm a formidable opponent.
That's right. And so it can be frustrating when you hear a theologian, someone like William Lane Craig, make that assertion that it's just indefensible, but clearly they're not up to date with the scientific evidence that you're doing such a good job presenting to us right now. Because how would they really address those points? I'd like to ask this, Dr. Grady. So in light of what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, you have these sedimentary rock layers that just extend over entire continents and beyond.
In some cases, hundreds of thousands of square miles.
Wow.
In the central part of the United States, roughly from our Midwest, kind of towards you, all the way out to our Southwest, we have contiguous layers that go for more than 1,000 miles. And then you take a look at how the extent, top, bottom, east, west, and so forth. The idea that can be generated by floods of equal depth multiple times so perfectly is impossible. Now, when we do look at sedimentation studies that have been done at sedimentary laboratories at the Colorado State University or in France, we have absolute proof that even in a vacuum, different size granules will form layers. But that in moving water, all of the layers form at the same time and continue to grow in the direction of water flow. I would suggest you could easily go on the internet. I have pictures of it included in my videos of what's called the wave out in Arizona. And in that one section, you see almost every kind of sedimentation that you can see, including folding, shearing, cross-hatching. It's amazing in just one photograph that you can see the layers were being laid down, that they are also being folded, and then they were sheared off completely, and then the other layers laid down on top of that. And I have photos from all over the world, quite literally. And these are of layers that are upside down, backwards, entire mountain ranges that are upside down. I mean, Matterhorn is a real scare for a geologist who believes in evolution. But it doesn't matter where we look. We see these layers out of order. And again, in Canada, I have pictures from up there. But all these mountain ranges, if you think in terms of evolution, these layers should be oldest on the bottom, youngest on the top, right? I mean, that's what you expect from the evolutionary interpretation. But the fact of the matter is they're not. They're often upside down, missing. Again, the Grand Canyon is supposedly 500 million years of layers. 140 is missing just to start with. And so it's not a perfect record. And while, again, there are places where the layers can be found in the order shown in the textbooks, the entire column cannot be. I have another little number for you if you want to, think about it. If you were to accept the evolutionary view of slow and gradual accumulation of these layers over time, first of all, remember that this would require many, many floods, and they would have to be at least continental in size, if you don't want to believe in global. But when you take a look at these things, and then you find all of the foldings and the bendings and all that other jazz. The shearings are very obvious. You can drive down a road where they had a road cut and see all the stuff I'm talking about in a minor version. But again, you have the artifacts in them. You have so many things that contradict slow and gradual that the person who believes in slow and gradual is doing it only by faith. It's religion. It's not science.
Yeah, my thinking in light of what you're saying is, and you mentioned it there, that those who deny a global flood, they have to say, well, we've had many local floods over time, not at the same time, but over time, forming these geologic features and layers. But with what you're saying, no, I mean, if these layers and features are extending over entire continents in some instances, then that would have to, and they match, you can correlate some of these mega sequences, then that would have to be a single catastrophic event creating those roughly at the same time. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
Yes, and we have talked about this before in the program too, that science, and I point out in Bible study, the two most important questions in science, and I was a scientist before I also became a theologian. I was an evolutionist before I became a creationist. But when you take a look at all these layers, and again, hundreds, thousands of layers, and in, like I say, whole bands where it's the same material but different layers, but all the same kind of material, you have to ask yourself, okay, that's what's there. But then ask yourself the question, what's not there? Because in science, those are the two most important questions in science. So when I make a scientific observation, I must, accurately describe what is present. I have to describe it correctly, accurately. But then you ask yourself the question, what's not there? Because we learn more by asking the second question than the first. And the same thing is true of Bible study. I mean, I could give you multiple illustrations. But when you think about it, all those layers, if they are supposed to be slow and gradual accumulation, if they're supposed to be one layer of exactly the same material laid down, let's say an inch thick, and then covered by another layer exactly the same material, 1 inch thick, and again and again and again, then each of those layers supposedly would have been exposed before the next layer was put down. Then why are there no soil horizons? Why are there no V-shaped erosion marks? Why are there no animal holes? Why are there no root holes? Which is what should be there if the evolutionist has given us the correct interpretation.
Wow. Those are some great questions. I would love to see somebody like William Lane Craig answer in a sophisticated manner. Those are some tough challenges right there.
I can assure you he couldn't answer them.
No, he couldn't.
He would simply deny them.
So, okay, a big challenge that more informed evolutionists like to put forth, and it seems like you've debunked it in many ways because the rock record is not as neat and orderly as they like to put forth in the textbooks. But they'll say, well, if there was a year-long worldwide flood event, then all these fossils that we find, they should be more scrambled, because they'll look to the lower layers and then the top layers and say we got progressive evolution from fish to fishermen, basically. And so what would be a good way to engage that argument from the ordering of the fossil record, Dr. Grady?
Well, again, of course, we don't deny that a lot of the fossils are in that evolutionary order because, supposedly as life evolved, they got sea life first, and then sea life crawled onto the land, right? I mean, that's general order. And we don't deny that you find tremendous trillions of seashells and sea life in the lower layers. But this is exactly what you'd expect to find in a worldwide flood, too. After all, clams don't have legs. They're going to get buried alive. I would ask the question, why do we find clams in layers with T-Rexes, though?
Right.
So you see that mixing that does not have consistency with the evolutionary thought process. They show you the T-Rex, but they don't show you the seashell that was found next to it. They don't want you to know about that.
Or all the mammal species that coexisted with the dinosaurs.
Well, and they're having to admit that there were more mammals in the record with the reptiles than that reptiles aren't pre-mammals.
Yeah, right.
They find a lot of inconsistencies there, and they're finally starting to agree that that's true. But I was talking about the layers, and if you think about it, if you could take the thickest layer of any one of the layers, you take the thickest layer of the Cambrian and the thickest layer of the Silurian and that you could find anywhere in the world. And then that would supposedly represent the maximum amount of time for accumulation of that layer, correct? Conceptually, just a thought exercise. Because if you found less than the maximum amount, you could simply say, well, part of it had eroded away after deposition, correct? And so the thickest layer would presumably represent the longest period of time for accumulation of that layer during the, quote, evolutionary process. And if you bring them all to one place and then stack them on one on top of the other, then the stack of layers would be 76 miles high. The problem is the average thickness of all the layers in the world, everywhere, is only 1.2 miles. Now that means there's 74.8 miles missing. I think that's a little bit of a challenge to get over.
Absolutely.
And again, the layers are not in the right order. You've got the polystrate fossils, you've got the missing evidence, you've got the evidence that ought not to be there, but is. The list becomes overwhelming.
And then you mentioned earlier these stratification experiments, these flume experiments.
Right.
If I understand correctly, where you got these layers formed rapidly in real time, we can observe it.
We've actually seen them being formed and laid down, and then the only thing that has to happen is to remove the water, and they'll lithify into rock. But I can't do it with my hands, but all the layers form at the same time. But there's a diagonal front edge. Okay, so as the water's flowing this way, and you've got muddy water, and that muddy water has different size grains. Then as the water's moving in one direction, the mud is also moving in the same direction. And there's sort of a diagonal front. And it goes this way, that the layers are all formed at the same time. Therefore, the layer at the bottom is the same age as the layer at the top. It's not older or younger.
So a fossil, these layers are forming horizontally,
right,
based on the moving water, the way that the
in the direction of water flow, right?
And so you could have a fossil that's lower in a lower layer, the same age,
older than the one at the top.
Wow. Yeah, and so that goes against all their ideas about the laws of superposition. Then, if
exactly, it's meaningless. Now, again, we don't deny that there's a general order in the layers,
right,
with the mammals towards the top, let's say, the birds towards the top. But that would be what you'd expect in a worldwide flood too. That the creatures that either could not move, like clams and oysters and mussels and so forth, are going to get buried where they are. Period. The trilobites living underwater are going to get buried. And it's really, some of the fossils of trilobites are really intriguing. It turns out that they often traveled one right behind the other in a series, like a locomotive with a train behind it. But that they are slow moving. They don't have long legs. So you would expect them to be buried first by rising muddy water. But of course, the creatures that had more intelligence and had more mobility, the longer the legs and the more the intelligence, shall we say, are going to try to keep from being drowned. So they're going to move upland. But because of tidal tsunamis, because of the flooding, it isn't like water rising in a bathtub. Because of the position of sun, moon, rotation of the earth,
Right.
there are going to be times when the water is going to rise, shall we say, faster in a location. But then because of a lower tide, then it's going to go back down. And then when you think about the dinosaur nests of eggs that we have found and the tracks that we have found, the trackways, I think it's very interesting, as a matter of fact, that one of the major trackways is along the east side of the American Rockies, and most of them are heading north towards Canada because that's where the higher ground was at the time. And these dinosaurs, they are dumb reptiles. I mean, reptiles are just dumb to begin with. But again, they're also slow. They don't have stamina. They have speed in quick bursts, but because of their hearts and lungs and so forth, the way they are, they're not like horses. They can't run. They can run very fast for 100 feet, but they can't run very fast for a mile. And so what's going to happen? The faster the creature, the more intelligent the creature, its ability to get to higher ground as the waters are rising, is one reason why, though we have found humans that drowned in the flood or found their bones or artifacts, etc., they're very rare. I mean, very rare. And one of the reasons is because they're some of the last to die. They're going to drown on the surface. When creatures drown on the surface, they don't necessarily get buried. They're going to disarticulate quickly. You've got creatures that are in the water that are looking for lunch, frankly. And so, yes, there should be a general order from shellfish to people in the record as you go up. So the concept of this superposition in a very mild sense would be true, but that does not have anything to do with the age.
Excellent points. I've spoken to several geologists that say in the field, when they're looking for fossils, consistently they find what? Mixed environments, sharks mixed with land creatures, mixed with plants. Right. That's what
it speaks of a worldwide flood.
Mm-hmm.
The water is moving this material around. And so it stirs things up, it mixes things up. That's why I say they want to show you the T-Rex, but they don't want to show you the shellfish that was buried with it.
Right.
Which shows the mixing of a marine environment with a terrestrial environment, which is indicative of a worldwide flood. It cannot be by local flood.
Wow. So more informed evolutionists, they would say, okay, the ordering of the fossils. Well, we have ordering to the rocks as well, or they'll say that the lower rocks, their challenge to us, Dr. Grady, is why do the lower rocks date older than the rocks at the top? And so they would say that that is evidence of their deep time evolution. How can we as creationists best, I know there's many ways to respond to that, but what's the best way to respond to that?
I'd really kind of like to say two things on that. In terms of, they didn't date those rocks with any technology whatsoever. They dated those rocks according to their religion. Now, how do they do that? There's no modern technology. I don't care what you're talking about, whether, carbon-14 short-term dating processes or long-term potassium argons and so forth, uranium lead. There none of these supposed dating technologies work. They all start with at least 6 fatal flaws. Carbon-14 has 20. They're totally useless to date anything beyond modern written record. The only thing that carbon-14 is good for is to prove the Earth is in fact young, and if you want, we could explain that too. But none of these technologies work. They're all based on at least 6 or more false assumptions. And carbon-14 not only has 20 scientifically false assumptions to try to use it to date something, there's also, of course, if we take the Bible seriously, the flood of Noah would drastically change the carbon cycle on Earth. So none of these techniques work. They don't date these rocks. At least the knowledgeable evolutionist doesn't date these rocks by any modern dating technology because they know they don't work. And I mean, I don't care what you're going to come up with. None of them work. They all have false assumptions. So how do they date the layers? Now, this is more to the point of your question, which is they date the layers by the fossils they contain, and then they date the fossils by the layers they're found in. It is self-serving circular reasoning, and there is no established date. It's a religious content that says, well, if I find this fossil, then the layer is that old. Well, how do you know it's that old? Well, because we found this fossil in it. And the Greeks called it a tautology that falls on its own weight in the science of logic. You cannot date the rocks by the fossils and then date the fossils by the rocks. That is absolutely illogical.
Circular reasoning.
It is circular reasoning, a tautology that falls on its own weight. And so when they say, well, these rocks are, the first question you ask, of course, as you know, is were you there? Because how do you know that?
Right.
And then they'll start, talking about dating technologies. Well, then that means they don't know what they're talking about because none of them work. And then they'll start talking about fossils dating rocks and rocks dating fossils. Now, I have a picture of that hammer that was found in Texas back in 1937. It is a obvious man-made hammer. The head of the hammer is a almost pure form of soft steel. The handle is still wood. It was broken in two, but where it was broken, a little bit of the wood is actually coal. But because of a seashell that was found next to it, evolutionists say that hammer is at least 440 million years old or more.
440 million years old.
Plus, yeah, 440 plus million years old.
And there's a hammer.
It's an obvious human manufacture. And we have found bells. We have found small iron cups. We have found all kinds of stuff in layers that are dated at more than 300 million or more than 100 million. We have lots of examples of those with photographic documentation.
A lot of good points there. And so a follow-up would be then for us as creationists, in light of what you're saying, how should we best answer the question dealing with the origin of radioactivity in general? Is this something that was at creation, or was it the result of the flood? Was it a deep rock phenomenon? How can we find an abundance of these radioactive elements in the first place, Dr. Grady?
Well, first of all, they had to be created as whatever parent isotope we're talking about. And then, of course, there's been decay since because of human sin and second law of thermodynamics. I mean, there's lots of things that are involved here. But for instance, there's nothing in nature that would cause uranium to come from carbon-14. You're not going to go up. It only goes down. Now, yes, we can get fusion, and yes, you can get power and light from fusion, etc. And one of the things we're looking forward to in the future is generating energy through fusion. But when it comes to the rock material, shall we say, what you have is created originally and decaying since.
Now, would we have to say, because I know there's different creation models on this, would we have to say that there's been periods of accelerated decay from uranium to lead, or has it been?
Well, exactly. First of all, one of the primary problems with trying to date something using radiometric dating processes is that you are assuming a constant decay rate. But we know from experimentation that if you change the environment, you can change the speed of decay, slow it down, speed it up. Many other problems, such as we're talking about uranium, supposedly a very long-term process of decay, 4.5 billion years for one half-life. But we know that simply acid rain will leach lead in and out of a system. So you don't know how much lead there was, or you're assuming there was none at all. Uranium is a salt in nature. Again, water can move it around. So you don't know what the initial parameters were. Therefore, it's absolutely silly to try to suggest that you can assume that, say, the decay rate was constant. But we know that's not true. We know that there are many things that influence decay rates. Again, water leaching material in or out is the most easy, probably. But we even know that the decay rate of radioactive materials on Earth is actually influenced slightly by the rotation of the central core of the sun. So there's a lot of things that cause these decay rates to change. And again, the parameters are unknown to begin with. And so your assumptions can give you anything you want. That's why I say it's religion. They want you to believe that these things work. They deceive you into believing it's science. But the fact of the matter is, it's basically stage magic.
Yeah, and then they'll invoke their precious isochron dating to say, well, that removes all of the assumptions, but I'm not sure what you've seen on it, Dr. Grady. I've seen papers that show discordant dates I've seen false isochrons too.
Well, that's it. Unless the data goes to the 0 point, they're useless. And basically, when you see these isochron charts that are being developed by evolutionists, they don't go through 0. Therefore, they're bad. Secondly, if you can use 2 different methods on the same rock, you would expect, if these things worked, to get approximately at least the same result. I think that's something we could all agree on. And yet, when you use 2 different methods on the same rock, you'll get vastly different results. The same thing is true of isochrons. When we take a look at a couple of the radioactive elements that we found on the moon, you get very different isochron dates, and yet they're supposed to have all come into existence at the same time.
Okay, so when they say we got these rocks from space or these moon rocks, and they line up perfectly with how we would believe that the Earth came about and then the moon and so on and so forth, that's not entirely accurate, is it then, Dr. Grady?
By no means. And we have at least 10 scientific reasons to know that the moon is in fact young, that it cannot possibly be old, including its heat loss, the recession rate from the Earth, again, radioactive elements that we found on the moon that ought not to even exist if it's as old as they say. And so we have at least 10 of those. But it doesn't matter where you look, you're going to find good science, data sets, not theory, not assumptions, that it's all young, and they all line up. Now, we're talking about geochronometers. Geochronometers do not tell you how old something is. It tells you it could be up to this old based on a particular parameter, but it could not be older. And so all of them are consistent with a 6,000-year-old creation. And I'm just talking about a 6,000-year-old Earth. I'm talking about a 6,000-year-old creation, because barred spiral galaxies, the amount of dust in the solar system, lumpy rings around planets. We have 4 planets with rings, and again, they couldn't possibly be old. They'd already be gone. I mean, there's one ring, a set of rings really, around Uranus that it's going to be gone within 100 years. The rings around Saturn are decaying rapidly. And what's happening is the inner portions of the rings are being sucked into the planet by gravity, but the outer portions are being thrown out through centrifugal and centripetal forces. So the rings are not going to last for a long time. And they're lumpy. I know that sounds like a silly scientific term, but it's very important. If the rings around these planets were as old as evolutionists say, they should be now uniformly thin. But the fact of the matter is they're still lumpy, which means they're still in the process of particles bumping into each other, breaking into smaller pieces. And so that proves they're not old, as evolutionists claim. The rotation rate of the sun, again, it just doesn't matter where you're looking. Heat loss of the moon, heat loss of the Earth. Lord Kelvin used that 150 years ago to defeat Darwinism.
Are there a lack of supernova remnants in our solar system?
We can only find about 250, which would indicate that our solar system is less than 7,000 years old.
Wow.
Those are SN1A supernova. But those are dead stars. Those are stars that have exploded. And I think that also leads to a very quick thought. If our solar system, also called our galaxy, called the Milky Way, were as old as evolutionists claim, we should have roughly 400 million dead stars. We can only find about 250.
Wow.
And so that proves, like I say, it's less than, well, no more than 7,000 years old anyway, consistent with 6,000. After all, some of them were so unstable, they would have, exploded very quickly. And then the more stable ones would then start to break down too. And so, again, it doesn't matter where you look. You see the evidence for a young creation everywhere in the universe.
With these pieces of evidence that you're pointing to, it's fascinating because you don't even have to be a Christian to look at that evidence and conclude, wow, okay, for all these reasons, the solar system, the universe itself can't be as old as secular scientists say.
Well, exactly. And I've said this on the program, I think sometime in the past, that even if I were not a Christian today, knowing the science that I know today, I would still have to believe in a young creation, right? Even if I didn't know God from a hot rock.
Yeah, because you see so many anti-young earth creationists. I've seen it on this channel during debates, prominent ones too. They'll say, you young earth creationists only believe in a young earth because the Bible tells you so, or you think the Bible tells you so. It doesn't have to do with science. But what you're saying is, no, even if you weren't a Christian, you'd be forced based on the science to believe in a young creation.
If you're honest, that it's a requirement. If you're an honest person and you took a look at the evidence, even if you had never touched the Bible, never heard of it, didn't know anything about the quote Christian God unquote, a good scientist today would still have to say the evidence is overwhelming that the creation we see around us is in fact young and consistent with 6,000 years old.
It's a great point. Wesley Coleman, our brother here in the chat, says they also pointing to critics of young earth creation. They also point to the dates corresponding. This is their assertion, Dr. Grady. They'll say, well, we've got ice cores and tree rings. They also correlate what we get with dating methods.
Not a chance.
Let's repeat that. Not a chance.
Shall I repeat that, Troy? Not a chance. Dendrochronology, which is the tree rings, is so full of errors that, yeah, we can correlate back hundreds of years, probably within reason. But then when you get back further into thousands, it gets impossible because of environmental conditions. The tree rings are not uniform. Some trees actually get more than one ring in a year because of the difference of what happens during the weather that year. Because of drought situations, they'll actually thicken up and look like one ring when they're actually multiple rings. But the ice cores is the one I would really like to get to. We now know with absolute authority that there have been ice cores done in Greenland by U.S. scientists. There have been cores done in Antarctica by Russian scientists at the Vostok Hole, the French and Italian consortium at Dome C. They say they've drilled down through the polar ice caps. They found 400,000 lines or 800,000 lines. First of all, that's not quite true. I mean, yes, there are rings towards the upper portions of the glaciers they're drilling through. However, because of the weight of the ice at the top, it squeezes the lines into total oblivion as you get into the middle and the lower sections. It's more extrapolation from there on out. But I absolutely agree. There's lines in the upper portions of the core, so that's true. But we now know with absolute authority that those lines are not annual rings like tree trunks. They are in fact individual storms. That every time there's a storm, you get a little dirty layer on top before the next storm comes along. And so the accumulation that we see in these ice cores is not annual accumulation. It's accumulation between individual storms. And therefore, based on that, Antarctic ice cap could have formed in only 3,000 years, but of course it actually is older than that. It started with the ice age beginning right after the flood, so that the polar caps in their total age go back about 4,500 years. But those lines in those cores are not individual years; they're individual storms. Now,
Were you?
anybody who lives in Canada,
That'd be me.
you 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 you're kind of familiar with snow,
Oh yeah.
and there are places I'm sure where they do ice the roads, or in some cases even heat them. But you've been out in the country where they were just plowing, isn't that true?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so after every snowfall, they plow. If they scrape the sides, then you see these exposed layers. Well, you simply compress those. They look exactly like the polar ice cores.
And you were saying in the middle, those lines get, if I understood you
Yeah,
correctly,
the weight. First of all, if you've ever been to glaciers, and I've been to many, um, there's that blue ice, that distinctive blue ice that comes from the core of glaciers. And the reason for that is the pressure has been so great that the air bubbles that were in there when the snow fell and then became ice and so forth, those air bubbles have literally been squeezed out of the ice, and you're looking at what is technically pure water. And it has this very unique, wonderful blue color. And it just gets better the farther down you go. But that's because of the compression from the ice, the weight of it above. So you get a glacier that's a couple hundred feet thick or a mile thick. I mean, we have glaciers that are more than a mile thick. Um, those air bubbles get squeezed out. That color blue of pure water, it develops. But when you drill through that, then these lines have been completely obliterated. Once you get down into, shall we say, roughly the middle, it's extrapolation. It isn't actually counting the rings. And so when they say they found 800,000 lines in the ice, well, yeah, they did find lines in the upper portions, but it gets into extrapolation at the bottom. But again, that doesn't mean that these cores are 800,000 years old. See, that's that stage magic where they equate it to the tree rings. You know, when you see a ring in the tree, that's a year. Well, these little lines in the ice cores, they're a year. And so they're deceiving you. It's illusion to get you to think that these are years, when in fact they're individual storms. And one of the things that proves that is the Lost Squadron up in Greenland, for instance,
yeah.
back in '42. So, uh, but the evolutionists is going to maintain their religion. They're going to continue to believe and continue to promote the idea that these lines are individual years. It's impossible. These are just individual storms with little lines of dirt and so forth accumulating after each one. And we've even seen them form in research done, near the surface where modern storms are still active.
Isn't it amazing, Dr. Grady, that we've seen for the most part all these features on the earth form in real time that they say require millions of years? You've talked about the Flume experiments. We've seen the formation of where you're talking about here, ice cores, these lines, oil, we can, and coal could be made rapid. All these different things that the evolutionists say require millions.
Of course, we can make coal in a matter of hours in a lab. We can make all the coal we needed, except that it takes more energy to make than you get out of it. so it's not economic, and that's why we don't do it. And there's plenty of natural coal out there that God provided for us. And that coal proves beyond a shadow of a doubt again that the earth is young and that there was a worldwide flood. I mean, we haven't gotten all the evidence. We continue to talk about the flood. I mean, for instance, if you go to Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, out there in the coal basins, there's a layer of pure anthracite coal that's 200 feet thick and another one 300 feet thick. Now, according to modern research with coal formation, that means that at one time, to get anthracite coal, you would have to have a layer 2,000 foot thick and 3,000 foot thick, with enough mud on top of that to compress it down to 200, 300, in order to get the anthracite coal. Well, only a worldwide flood could do that. It's impossible for a local flood to do that.
Wow. Great points there. Howard F. has one here from our chat. Our discussion here has generated some really good discussions in our live chat. As always, they're enjoying this, Dr. Grady. Hey, I told everybody at the beginning, you're well-rounded mentally well-rounded.
Thank you.
You can tell that you're a theologian and a scientist and up to date on all of this.
But I was a scientist first. Became a theologian as well later.
Yeah, I love it. That's why we love having you on, brother.
Well, coral reefs, again, you have to remember that there were warm tropical seas that were in existence from creation to the flood, and that the flood waters were more than sufficient to actually break them up and push them around. Of course, that's one possibility in places. Also, corals actually grow quite rapidly under ideal conditions. So finding them throughout North America is not an issue. It's just how did they get there? That's the issue. I would point out to you, I mentioned that there were islands at creation, that we had Pangaea. Basically, 40% of the surface of the earth was dry land with seas surrounding it that were probably a half a mile or roughly that deep. They're warm. We're going to get tremendous amounts of growth of marine creatures. The White Cliffs of Dover formed very rapidly. I mean, unknown trillions of single-celled fossils there, although there are fossils of higher creatures too. I've seen them. But they formed from basically the kind of blooms we talk about, the red tide kind of blooms. Because in very warm water under excellent conditions, those things multiply multiple generations in a day. So under proper conditions, coral can grow very, very quickly too. Plenty of nutrients in the water at that time that aren't as abundant today, because a lot of those nutrients have actually been incorporated into various materials. But I mentioned the islands. The islands today are called guyos. Now, the guyos. These are underwater seamounts with flat tops. They are roughly 5,000 feet or roughly a mile below the surface of the ocean today. But around the top edge of these guyos, which are not volcanic cones, they're flat topped, we find sandy beaches, and below the sandy beaches, going around the top of these islands, so to speak, like a ring, we find dead coral reefs. But it is the kind of coral that only exists within 300 feet of the surface. It's the kind of coral that requires sunlight. Now, there's two kinds of coral. There's the soft coral most people think of, and there's the hard corals, which grow in total darkness and are used to make jewelry. Not exactly cheap jewelry, but it's not diamonds either. But for instance, you can buy them in jewelry shops. And so this is the kind of coral that requires photosynthesis. This is the kind of coral that only grows within 300 feet of the surface. So you tell me, what are they doing 5,000 feet below sea level? It's because these were islands at the time of creation with active coral reefs and beaches. And what happens? A mile of water comes up from below, and the ocean floor, the entire Pacific Ocean floor, goes down a mile like an elevator. And now they're there with dead coral reefs and sandy beaches and flat tops and a mile underwater, which proves that they were at one time at the surface.
I was thinking as you're answering that, there's a clip-worthy answer for a video answering this coral reef challenge, Dr. Grady, because a lot of people bring that up. A lot of critics bring that up. Another one they bring up, and I'm curious as to your thoughts. Do you think that we have a difficult time as creationists explaining all the limestone on the earth today, or do we have a good answer for that from the flood perspective?
Oh, again, that comes from the flood. I'm sure you would like to go to the Bahamas with me for a couple of days.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I was pretty sure I could convince you of
that. Wouldn't take much. My wife will probably want to come along too.
Well, hey. So Think with me for a second. We could go to the Bahamas today, strap on some scuba gear, tanks, go down, and you will literally be able to see the limestone form in front of your face in an hour.
Wow.
It grows that fast. And it's a chemical reaction in the water
Hmm.
that deposits the limestone. So limestone forms very quickly. We now know that granite forms very quickly. It's, foundation rock, but it forms very quickly. That in nature, geological features all form quickly. That's not the issue. And so you can even find people who, I don't personally recommend it, mind you, don't get me wrong, but put on scuba gear, go to the Bahamas, go down. They can stick an empty washed out Coca-Cola can and literally form see the limestone form around it. And again, I want to point out the coral reefs that we find in North America. I really want to go back and address that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Those are pre-flood. Okay. Now think with me. Coral grows, we think, in seawater, correct? Salty water. But there was salty water, but not as salty as today. I mean, the oceans today are averaging about 3.5% salt content. But before the flood, it was probably more like 1.5%. I mean, when God created the seas at the time of creation, they were not distilled water. And besides that, how many of you think that those living creatures could be created in distilled water, that they would live in distilled water and not cause the distilled water to become undistilled? Excuse me. And so that proves that these corals could grow in less salt content than you think of today, correct? The same thing is true of the fish. The fish lived in the water. I know, redundant. But on the dry land, we didn't have the rivers, the lakes, like the Great Lakes, for instance, before the flood. That comes afterwards. And the separation between those fish that can live only in fresh water and those that can live only in salt water and those that can do both, and there are lots of fish that still do both, were alive at the same time as those coral reefs, correct?
Right.
Okay. So again, those corals were growing in water that was not nearly as salty as the oceans today and could well have been growing again in much less salt content, possibly in place, because again, there's salt in fresh water. When we say freshwater lakes and the wonderful lakes you have in Canada,
Yes.
they've got salt in them. So why couldn't these be corals that were growing in less salty conditions prior to the flood, then buried by the flood?
So are they making assumptions then on the rapid formation of coral reefs, looking at conditions today?
See, that's the mistake that evolutionists do. They'll say, well, whatever, and this, of course, Charles Lyell, going back to before Darwin, the Scottish lawyer who was teaching geology and wasn't a geologist. But he was the one about uniformitarianism, that whatever is happening today is exactly what's been happening in the past at exactly the same rate. Well, again, that's a false scientific point right there. But again, just as there was a separation between those fish that could live in less salt content and those that could survive in more salt content, or those that could survive in both, and I mentioned salmon just to start with, then these corals that we find buried in the North American continent and other places could have been growing in the water before the flood. It had far less salt than today, but maybe either those corals can grow with more or less salt, or maybe some of the species were eliminated, becoming extinct because of the flood, as some fish did. So there's a lot of reasons to understand that there's no problem from a creation standpoint with them existing.
So you mentioned a couple things over the last few minutes, the conditions, assumptions on that. But when it comes to the limestone, you mentioned it's a chemical reaction. So this chemical limestone, and then you mentioned earlier in the program, the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, and we have good evidence for that. So at the time of the flood, when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, could that have helped with the necessary chemicals to rapidly form a lot of this
Well, there's no
limestone?
question, but think with me for just a second. When we dig up an old gas station, or we dig up the old gas tanks that were made out of steel and replace them with fiberglass tanks we do today, how do you cut up those steel tanks and dispose of them? After all, they've got volatile fuels or fumes inside. You don't use an acetylene torch, correct? Because
Yeah.
if you do, when you wake up, you're going to be in heaven or hell,
Yeah.
right?
If you're unsaved, you're going to go from hot to hot. Yeah.
Hot to hotter. So how do you cut them up? You
How?
use water jets. So there's no possibility of flame, no possibility of an explosion. We use high pressure water jets to cut steel. Well, let's think about this for a second. This super hot, super critical water that comes up at the time of the flood at 900 degrees Fahrenheit initially. As it's coming up with great force. This is equal to volcanic eruption force. It erodes the sides surrounding the water. It's going to erode rock as it's coming up and out. That's why I mentioned comets. The comets are big, dirty ice balls. There's a lot of reason to believe that comets were created at the flood by this water coming up at speeds that were so fast that some of it was even escape velocity. And it's eroding the sides as the water's coming up. Well, that's going to add a lot of mineral to the oceans. That's why I say that the oceans before the flood had far less salt content, but they had some, but far less than today's oceans. But even our freshwater lakes have salt in them. Creatures can't exist without that. And so the time of the flood, you also, because of the tidal tsunamis, you literally scrape the quote mountains, the low mountains, hills, any surface that existed before. You are literally eroding them into nothing but muddy water. And so there's a lot of increase in mineral content in the oceans. The mud layers get deposited, but a lot of that mineral remain dissolved in that water.
You know, I'm thinking here as you give these answers, tree ring dating, ice core dating, limestone, coal, oil, all these things that anti-young earth creationists like theistic evolutionists, we could say William Lane Craig, put forth as a challenge. I would say more informed evolutionists. You know, most I don't think are informed enough to even know these objections. But yet you have great, sufficient answers, and not only answers, but you're providing a superior model in explaining all these features.
Yes,
Dr. Grady.
And again, we need to understand that you cannot test creation or evolution directly. You can only test them indirectly. And how do you do that? Well, you make models and you make sets of predictions, and then you ask yourself the question, which are the two models, which of the two sets of predictions do the facts that we know fit best? And every single instance, creation wins hands down.
Amen. It really does, as you're showcasing. And so what critics of the global flood like to say is they'll say, well, this worldwide flood event combined with, you know, some of the heat and energy produced would have killed all the plants. And therefore, with nothing to eat, everything after the flood, all the animals that would have come off of the ark, they would have died. And so there wouldn't have been able to be any repopulating of the earth, Dr. Grady. I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
Well, again, that's because I would say it's foolishness, but somebody haven't read the Bible. Remember that they went into the ark 7 days before the flood began. I believe I know why. But then the flood itself, the water going up gradually, not all at one time, but the water goes up gradually for 150 days, goes back down gradually for 150 days. But they did not come out of the ark until 70 days after the water had gone down. And that's, remember the story of the two birds. The raven goes out and doesn't come back because it's omnivorous. It can live on the dead bodies that are outside. However, the dove is a pure vegetarian. And so the dove goes out and comes back because there's no vegetation. But that muddy water contains seeds. And so the 70 days allows for the earth to dry out hard enough you could walk on it. You can't just open the door and step out. I mean, you'd be stepping out into wet mud layers that in places would be over a mile thick. So you'd just be sucked into the mud. So the 70 days allows the mud to dry out hard enough to walk on, but it also allows 70 days for the seeds that are contained in the mud to germinate. And when the dove does come back with a leaf from a freshly germinated olive tree, it proves that there's now enough vegetation outside to, in fact, take care of the animals. And remember Genesis 1, 29 and 30. God made them all, including T-Rexes and velociraptors and oviraptors, made them all vegetarians initially. And today, evolutionists actually, at the highest levels, agree. Now, you're going to find your high school science teacher that doesn't know their head from a hole in the ground, that doesn't know that. But 23 years ago, evolutionists declared that T-Rexes and velociraptors were in fact vegetarians for very good scientific reasons, including coprolite.
Wow.
So the fact of the matter is that you had to wait for the seeds to germinate to get enough food for the animals to eat. But when that proof is provided by the dove, and really, of course, it's the Holy Spirit and God, saying, okay, now you can open the door. But it's based on having the vegetation growing from those seeds that were trapped. Now, we know that tremendous amounts of plants became extinct at the flood. However, there were no seeds from those that did survive to germinate. And that provided food for the animals and for the people, too, because they were still vegetarians. People don't start eating meat until Genesis 9:3.
It kind of makes me think something you said earlier. The evolutionists, they have a science fiction religion, Dr. Grady, and they have to preserve it at all costs.
Yes, sir.
And so these are the best kinds of objections they can put forth. And I think you said before your answer, clearly they haven't read the Bible.
Yes, sir.
And so, and so in many ways, these challenges are straw man arguments. And okay, as always, Dr. Grady, time flies by with you. We are almost at our 2-hour mark here.
And I am going to have to close out. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So no, that's okay. You've done a great job. And so what I'll do is, I think this was good because we largely stuck to the flood, the age of the earth, science. And since we typically get together every few months, Dr. Grady, I'm going to save the evolution material for our next program. And that'll get people excited. Something to look forward to.
Okay. You got it.
Okay. Well, Dr. Grady, I appreciate your time as always. You're an encyclopedia worth of information. I think we touched on a lot. I wanted to go through a lot. I really wanted to cover the flood, both from scripture and from science. I thought it was important in light of William Lane Craig's current comments to show why those kinds of comments are uninformed. Dr. Grady, you've done an excellent job tonight, my brother, as always. So I want to give you the floor, though. If there's anything you wanted to leave myself with or our audience, we've had a great chat. We've had a lively chat with a lot of comments and feedback. Good mix of critics and non-critics, as always, which is good because I like to plant some seeds. Hopefully some seeds have been planted here tonight, Dr. Grady. Any final thoughts from you?
Well, again, we can talk a lot about science. And of course, there are many, many scientific proofs the earth and the universe are young. And these scientific proofs also relate to the fact that the Lord Jesus Christ is coming back soon. I'm not saying when, but soon. Because many of these scientific proofs show that not only is the earth young, the universe is young, it also shows that God never intended the earth to last for a long time once it became imperfect with human sin. And so the correlation with the Bible and the science is irrefutable. They line up perfectly. And I just want everybody to understand that the Bible is telling you the truth. It is not simply accurate. It is not simply telling us the truth. It is hyper accurate. It is totally reliable in all things from a theological standpoint, and it contains much accurate science.
Amen. Well said, Dr. Grady. Anybody who tuned in, and if they're open-minded, they will be forced after this program to believe that the Bible teaches a global flood. It's the global Genesis flood, not the local Genesis flood. And science has confirmed the worldwide flood of Genesis. You've dismantled objections related to tree ring dating, ice core dating, dating methods in general, the ordering in the fossil record, Dr. Grady, coal, limestone. We've covered a lot tonight. And so this has been comprehensive. And okay, to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate your questions, your comments. And I think I can speak for the audience, Dr. Grady. I'm already looking forward to our next program together, brother. So God bless you. To the audience, God bless you as well. And we'll see you guys Friday for another program very similar to this. Okay, Standing for Truth is out. Have a great night, all.